Good morning and welcome to This Week. A new cliff is here.
These cuts are not smart.
It's a stupid way to govern.
Across-the-board spending cuts just 5 days away.
This is going to have a real impact.
Balderdash. The president is making stuff up.
Will they hit too hard? Are the warnings too hyped? What will this stalemate really mean for you and your family? Plus, Chinese hackers target America.
This is not movie stuff. This is real. It's happening thousands of times a day.
Joe Biden targets the NRA.
You don't need an AR-15. Buy a shotgun.
And the Oscars hit Washington.
It's a rat's nest in there.
We take on all the week's politics right now.
From ABC News, This Week with George Stephanopoulos. Reporting from ABC News headquarters, George Stephanopoulos.
Hello again. 18 months ago, the White House and Congress agreed to a doomsday plan, across-the-board spending cuts so unpalatable they would force Washington to find a better fix to our budget mess. No dice, no last-minute deal, no matter what. That sequester will start on Friday. The battle over what it will mean and who's to blame has already begun. We're going to debate all that on our Powerhouse Roundtable, but first, some facts. The Pentagon will take the biggest hit from the cuts. Take a look at the breakdown. About half the cuts this year come from defense. And President Obama warned of dire consequences yesterday.
The threat of these cuts has forced the Navy to delay the deployment of an aircraft carrier to the Persian Gulf, affecting our ability to respond to threats in an unstable part of the world. And just this week, the Pentagon announced that if these cuts go through, almost 800,000 defense employees, the equivalent of every person in Miami and Cleveland combined, will be forced to take an unpaid leave.
And with that, let's take the debate to our first roundtable, headlined by the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Mike Rogers of Michigan, the lead Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Eliot Engel of New York, and our own George Will and Christiane Amanpour. Welcome to all of you. And Congressman Rogers, let's begin. Is the harm as great as the president suggests?
Well, there will be impact on national security, there's no doubt. And I think there's some misnomer. So it's really only 2 cents on the dollar over the whole federal budget. But they've scrunched that down into 7 months and highlighted, or at least put most of the burden on the Defense Department. So that is going to have an impact. That's a 13% cut. The best way to get through this, I mean, we can point fingers, we can get all through this. The best way to do it is just allow flexibility. If you allow flexibility, you don't have to shut down the carrier.
I wanted to bring that to Congressman Engel, because the White House has been resisting having this flexibility.
Well, you know, I think the sequester was a stupid thing. I voted against it when it first came up. Congress keeps kicking the can, down the road. It's really a ridiculous thing to do. The fact is that we need to do things that are smart, not take a meat cleaver and just hack cuts.
So should the White House accept this call from Republicans in Congress to have more flexibility over where to hit with the cuts and when?
I think that Congress should sit down and avoid the sequester. And if the sequester kicks in for a week or two, we should then fix it so it doesn't become a permanent thing.
The Navy insists that they really did have no choice but to delay the deployment from Norfolk to the Persian Gulf of the aircraft carrier Truman. If so, if they really have no wiggle room at all and an enormous budget to shift funds from one to another, that suggests to me that flexibility is what the administration does not want them to have, because they want to maximize the pain. They want disruptions in air travel and all the rest to put pressure on the Republicans to unravel the sequester.
But one thing that is certain to happen, Congressman Rogers, is that right now, at least within a month, you're going to have these furloughs on the civilian employees of the Defense Department. That's a 20% pay cut.
Well, and again, if we have flexibility, there's a big difference from a sailor on the Eisenhower out in the Mediterranean and the travel coordinator at the EPA. You can't treat them the same. And the way this is structured, it treats everyone the same. Can't do that. If you give them this flexibility, they can make the determination, yes, that second carrier group ought to steam to the Mediterranean. That's a national defense issue, I argue. We have intelligence operations that could get slowed down or stopped. That's a problem. But if you sit down and talk to these folks and say, if you had the flexibility, can you find 2 cents on the dollar of efficiencies other than cutting the bone? They'll tell you, yes, we can.
And Christiane, I know you talked to a lot of sources overseas. They kind of scratch their heads.
They really do, George. Honestly, it's here we go again, government by crisis, lurching from left to right. And the military, sacrosanct in the United States, is now in play, as you're discussing. And it's not just the aircraft carrier and intelligence and the Navy. It is also flight hours. They're having to cut down what the Air Force personnel can do, what pilots can do. They might not be ready once they're allowed to go back to work. And even deployments for troops overseas, unable to sort of perhaps, transfer and transfer personnel out there. People will have to have longer deployments. So the whole thing doesn't make sense when viewed from outside.
I want to get to more on this in our second roundtable, but now another big headline from this week. We saw a report coming out detailing Chinese attacks, Chinese military cyber attacks on U.S. targets, 140 targets. Look at this from the New York Times. It said that there had been increasingly, the focus is on companies involved in the critical infrastructure of the United States, its electrical power grid, gas lines, and waterworks. According to the security researchers, one target was a company with remote access to more than 60% of oil and gas pipelines in North America. A serious threat over several years. It drew the attention of the former head of the CIA, Mike Hayden.
You can follow the advice my dad gave me when I came home at 9 years of age after losing a fight, in which he said, quit whining, act like a man, and defend yourself. There are lots of ways we can make this relationship less comfortable to them. If this is important, and I think you and I agree that it is, then you've got to start taking some actions.
And Congressman Rogers, you're the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. You say this is a war we're losing.
We are losing. And 141 targets pales in comparison. That's probably every day. We get hit every single day by a whole series of levels of types of attacks. Everything from criminals trying to get into your bank account or steal your identity to nation states like China who are investing billions, hiring thousands.
You believe that the Chinese government, the Chinese military is behind this?
Beyond a shadow of a doubt. They use their military and intelligence structure to steal intellectual property from American businesses and European businesses and Asian businesses, repurpose it, and then compete in the international market against the United States. It is unprecedented. This has never happened in the history of the world where one nation steals the intellectual property to repurpose it to illegally compete against a country. And I'll tell you, it is as bad as I've ever seen it, and exponentially getting worse. Why? There's no consequence for it.
And the Times report, which quoted this Mandiant group, traced this latest outbreak of cyber warfare to this building in Shanghai, a 12-story building. I mean, they traced it to the doorstep, building 61398, out of a spy novel, but that is a building and a unit owned by the PLA.
And George, one of the things we've seen is that companies have been unwilling to talk about this, even though they've been getting hit every day. That is changing now.
It is. They're dealing with a very difficult, frankly, a gangster regime in China right now, and no one wants to make them unhappy. But George, last June, David Sanger in the New York Times ran a story. From his first months in office, President Obama secretly ordered sophisticated attacks on the computer systems that run Iran's main nuclear enrichment facilities. It began under the Bush administration. We have participated in cyber sabotage.
And that's what the Chinese are saying.
And it turns out, what if China is thinking, look, we can try and compete with the United States, build a big blue water navy and aircraft carriers and all the rest, or maybe we can just learn how to disable the massive infrastructure of our potential ally.
If I can respond, this is an important difference. The United States does not use its military intelligence services for economic espionage. Right. We do not do it. It's prohibited. Now, to say, as the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, it'd be crazy to say that we don't conduct espionage operations. We've done it since George Washington sent Nathan Hale into New York City to find out what the British were doing. It is a long-standing tradition between nations. This is very, very different. Very different.
And
I think this gets to our fundamental relationships with the Chinese. I think we have to make it very clear to them that this cannot be business as usual. If they're going to continue to do this to the extent that they're doing it, it's a price to pay. I was just in Beijing with the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Congressman Royce, and we raised this with the top Chinese officials, and they just let it roll off their back. They poo-poo it. They don't admit to it.
Is the White House pressuring hard enough?
Well, I think they can always do it more. I think they are doing it hard enough. I think they're making it clear. But I think it's got to be a fundamental stand that we need to take with the Chinese. It can't be business as usual and everything else if they're going to continue to do this.
So what is the way to fight back? Is it sanctions? Is it some kind of trade?
Yes, and yes. Yeah. I argue you need to start indicting bad actors. You need to start impacting individuals' ability who are participating in this activity in China to get visas, their family to get visas. It needs to be a direct bilateral discussion, point 1, 2, and 3. It's that serious. We had one American manufacturing company, a very large, well-known company, who was hacked, had their blueprint stolen, if you will. that estimates 25,000 American manufacturing jobs lost.
Leon
This
Panetta
is
called it
serious.
cyber Pearl Harbor.
Harbor.
It could be cyber Pearl Harbor.
But again, there's an intellectual blank slate right now on which the international community needs to write rules and laws about a new form of weapon. Again, David Sanger last June, it appears to be the first time the United States has repeatedly used cyber weapons to cripple another country's infrastructure. I take your point, it's different. But we are now
You can't believe everything you read in the press, George, about ascribing who might be the author of that.
Are you saying
particular
Stuxnet
attack.
is not?
I'm just saying I'd be very cautious about ascribing authorship of that particular event.
Well, would there be anything wrong if the United States was trying to sabotage the Iranian nuclear program?
If it's the same type of activity that we would engage in to prevent a nuclear disaster anywhere in the world that would harm either our allies or the United States. So those kind of things happen. Now, here's the difference. If someone comes into your office and steals your sensitive intellectual property and walks out the door with it, that's a crime. What difference does it make if I do it in person or I do it through my computer? It shouldn't be any difference. And that's why I'm arguing, let's start the indictment process, even in absentia, to send the message to China that you cannot, if you want to be an international player, you cannot act like a thief in the night.
One more question on this. Okay, you're talking mostly about economic espionage here. How serious in the future is the threat that this would actually be a military?
Huge. Here's the scary part of this. It's already part of military planning for the Russians, for the Chinese, and here's where it gets interesting, now the Iranians. So there's a company called Aramco in Saudi Arabia, a very sophisticated attack. It basically killed 30,000 machines, meaning you're not going to reboot that computer of yours. You've lost everything on it. It manipulated data, changed data, and destroyed data. Very, very serious to the functioning of that company. Now they're here in the United States. It's been ascribed to the Iranians that they were probing our financial institutions with it's called a denial of service attack, which is very low on the sophistication scale. Aramco very high on the sophistication scale, which means they're probing, looking for vulnerabilities. They're already looking to disrupt. China would be a rational actor, wouldn't pay for them to use a military-style disruption attack. Same with the Russians. You can't say that for the Iranians.
Can there be a regime of deterrence here, just as we've deterred with conventional forces, deterred with nuclear forces? Can we have deterrence with cyber war?
You can, except if you're going to go punch your neighbor in the nose, best to hit the weight room for a couple of months. We cannot protect our private sector. We're not ready yet. We are completely vulnerable to this.
I want to move on to another subject, Syria. The situation seemed to deteriorate this week. Our own Terry Moran spent the week in Syria, was there for that massive bombing. And we talked to him earlier this morning about the options the U.S. has right now.
George, we just got out of Syria, and the first thing to say, it looks like the situation there is going to go from worse to worse. You've got rising sectarian hatred, radical jihadists, including al-Qaeda, taking a lead role in the fight, and now staking their claim to the future in Syria. Massive war crimes, rising violence and criminality, and we could find no evidence that Bashar Assad or his army is about to break. Quite the contrary. Many people told us at the beginning of the revolution they wanted to change the government. Now, given the chaos, they don't. The United States has a choice. Arm the rebels, engage even more deeply in what is becoming a chaotic and dangerous war for this region, or broker a peace, probably with Russia, give the Syrian people an opportunity to determine their future, and at least in the first stages, Bashar Assad is likely to be part of that process. George?
Congressman Engel, is that the choice?
I think it's the choice, and I will be introducing legislation to allow the president to arm the rebels. I think it's time to do that. I think the Free Syria Army needs help. We know who they are, and I think it's time that we make that move.
I've spoken with White House officials about this, and they make two arguments against precipitously arming the rebels. They say, one, you don't want them to have shoulder-fired missiles because of the threat to commercial aircraft, and two, the argument that the opposition is getting about what it needs right now from the Gulf states.
Well, shoulder-fired weapons, I'm not talking about that, but I certainly think that there are other things that we can get to them. It's never the right time. There's always a time that could be better, but I think that we run the risk of seeing Assad hang on a long time. He's a bad player. You know, back in 1979, when his father was in power, the State Department promulgated a list of countries which aid and abet terrorism. Syria was a charter member of that list. In 2004, I wrote the Syria Accountability Act, which slaps sanctions on Syria, passed the Congress and the Senate, signed into law by President Bush. Nothing has changed in Syria. This has been a regime that governs with an iron fist. They've murdered tens of thousands of their own people. There's almost 1 million people displaced. It has the potential to disrupt other countries like Jordan all around. And I think it's time the United States take a firm stand by arming the rebels.
You agree?
Listen, the best that we can hope for now is the best of the worst outcomes. So the United States doesn't have credibility with the opposition now. So any diplomatic negotiated settlement here, the United States can't play an important role because they don't have the faith and confidence of the opposition. Clearly, Russia is playing a game here that could be helpful. I do agree we ought to engage them. Here's what I think we should do. I think we need to, right now, the Qataris, the Jordanians, the Saudis, the Turks are all putting weapon systems into Syria to aid the opposition. The Islamists have attached themselves to most of the secular units. Almost every unit now has Islamists as some of their main fighters. They're well-financed. They'll fight to the death. And opposition commanders tell us that they need them and count on them for the fight. That's a huge problem for the United States. We have all of those weapon systems, including conventional weapons, that will awash the Levant across the Middle East if we don't get this right. It's time that we take a more affirmative leadership role at this table with all of the Arab League. I would have a no-fly zone in the north, a safe zone in the north, and coordinate all of the weapon systems that are going in so that at least we have the credibility for a negotiated settlement. We don't have.
Congressman talks about credibility. Secretary Kerry going over this week to the Middle East, but will not be meeting with the opposition.
That's absolutely true. In Rome, where they were meant to be meeting, the opposition is actually boycotting because of what they say is an unacceptable U.S. and international response to the Syria. But look, there's so much that's complicated. You say the White House talks about not precipitously. Well, that's really, precipitously. This has been 2 years now, and all the reasons for not intervening have actually come true because of not intervening. If you look at the front of The Economist this week, it says Syria, death of a country. Why is that important? Beyond the tens of thousands of Syrians and all the things you've just outlined, friends of the United States around being destabilized, the massive amount of weapons that could be loose, just like happened in Libya and are now, threatening West Africa with Al-Qaeda popping up. And beyond that, do we want to see Syria become Somalia? Do we not remember what Somalia was and the danger Somalia was for the United States and for that whole region? And so the options, as far as I can see, is the U.S. does what you're suggesting, tries to have skin in the game, tries to have some credibility on the ground, some influence on the ground, and turns what is a war anyway into a shorter war rather than a longer war that's leading to Somalia.
Seems to be some consensus around the table, George.
Well, let me try and disrupt the harmony.
Please don't. You're so nice.
We have two objectives, the humanitarian objective of economizing violence and the strategic objective of controlling the outcome. And they may be in conflict. No analogy is perfect, but go back to the Spanish Civil War that began in 1936. By the time it got in full-blown proportions, there was no happy choice. We're going to be the communists were going to control Spain, or Franco was going to control Spain. And we may be at that point in Syria. Now, you say, Congressman, we know who the rebels are. How do we know?
Well, you've gone in and...
We know the Free Army, but let me just say one other thing. There's another thing that's very important here. It's a blow to Iran if Assad falls. Assad has been the best ally of Iran, of Hezbollah, a terrorist organization. And by the way, the Europeans should designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. But Iran would be dealt a blow. They are fighting. They have their soldiers in Syria. Hezbollah's fighting in Syria. This would be a strategic blow to Iran if Assad fell.
And I want to get to Iran right now because David Muir spent the week there as well to look at, spent some time in Tehran, around the country, and took a look at how hard the sanctions, the international sanctions, are hitting.
Well, George, good morning. There's really no question that the economic sanctions, the tightening sanctions led by the U.S. are truly being felt here in Iran. So many people we talked with talked about the prices going up dramatically here, inflation at rates of 40% in some places. So there's no question that people are feeling these sanctions. The question is whether or not the leadership is feeling it and whether they're going to do anything about it. The Supreme Leader here saying that America needs to prove its goodwill. The President saying they're not going to go to the negotiating table with a gun to their head by America. All of that alluding to the economic sanctions. So the people here feeling it, but whether or not that's going to press leaders as they head to that negotiating table next week is the big question this morning, George.
That is the question, Christiane. And overnight, President Ahmadinejad did concede, however, that it has been a very difficult year for the Iranian economy.
Oh, it's been catastrophic. I mean, all our reporting, or just talking to individuals in Iran, it's been catastrophic for the people. But as David says, it has less affected the regime. And what it has done is militarized Iran. In other words, now everything is viewed in the parameter of war. So this is why the Revolutionary Guard in Iran are now taking over, yet another excuse for them to take over so many of the institutions. Everything from the press to information to everything is being looked at through the parameter of war. But I think what's interesting is that there was a very interesting conversation with the Iranian ambassador here, the only senior Iranian ambassador or official here, who said that we can have talks. We don't want it with a gun to our head, that's what they always say, but we don't have red lines except that the United States has to accept our rights under the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is to enrich. So the question really is, will the Congress, will the political sphere here in the United States allow real diplomacy, allow the administration to conduct a diplomacy which is not just sticks and has some painful maybe, but carrots, to have a real diplomatic negotiation.
And the tension there, though, Congressman, I want to bring this to you, is that the fear that these talks are just a stalling tactic.
Well, the most productive thing we've gotten with talks so far is an agreement for more talks. That stalling, that time, has cost us in their development of their nuclear weapons program. They just recently put in more sophisticated centrifuges to spin up highly enriched uranium that could be weapons
At the same
grade.
time, though, they agree to limits on the enriched uranium.
But here's the problem. Think about the consequence of a nuclear Iran. This isn't France. This isn't Great Britain. This isn't rational actors. These folks have committed acts of terror. They killed as many as 600 or contributed to the killing of 600 U.S. soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan by introducing weapons systems and training and money. Bulgaria is now going to the EU to try to get at least some tougher sanctions on Hezbollah through Iran because of their they attempted to kill the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C. Imagine what a nuclear Iran looks like. A nuclear arms race in the Middle East, I guarantee you, will start. That's very destabilizing.
If the president means what he has said repeatedly and clearly, a nuclear Iran means war with the United States. The president has said he does not endorse containment of Iran. They will not have, he says, nuclear weapons. So if they cross that threshold, there must be some red line somewhere that means not a nuclear Iran, but a war with Iran.
Well, I mean, there's other options up to war.
Well, I think the worst possible scenario would be a nuclear-armed Iran. I think that has to be stopped by any and all measures.
Which the president has pledged to do.
Well, I'm glad he has. I think it's a good thing that he's said that and done that. And I think that we need to work in consultation with our European allies to make sure that that doesn't happen. I was going to say they've been bad players straight on. They're not negotiating, in my opinion, in good faith. And I think we have to understand that.
Well, the real question is what to do. We can talk about this until we're blue in the face, which we have done for decades now. The most painful sanctions ever imposed on Iran are underway right now. And as you see, they're not affecting necessarily their continued desire to enrich and other such things. So the real question is, what does one do? And you say irrational, but the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dempsey, has said publicly that he believes Iran is a rational actor. So really, this is not an argument. It's really
let me rephrase what he was talking about. In terms of direct military conflict with the United States, that isn't being rational, it's being sane. They're going to lose that fight.
Correct.
But their committed acts of terrorism around the world is not rational. The fact that they're trying to get after our financial institutions here through cyber attacks is not a rational act.
But the real issue is, what does one do beyond
and I want to get to that because we have to move on. I just want to ask you a very quick question, yes or no. Will there be a military conflict with Iran this year, or do you believe there's another way to block their program?
I think there are other ways to block their program, and we should pursue them vigorously.
Okay, Congressman, thank you very much. Thanks to you, Christiane. I know you're going to stick around for our Web Extra.